in each of the sections. We're going to, in the first one, I'm going to do a basic overview of the piece, give you an introduction to some of the historical background. We're going to start working through some of the music, and my guest for today will be Julius Tolentino, who will come in and talk about the famous saxophone solo in the old castle, and talk to you a bit about the use of the saxophone in French music at the time, which is very interesting. A lot of people don't know about how the saxophone developed and stuff, so it's a particular topic that's of interest, and it's a very famous moment in the piece, so it's one of the ones we're going to talk about. So every week I'll have a guest who will demonstrate and talk about some aspect of the piece that'll be important. In the second week, we'll spend much more time going through a lot of logistics of the music, but for the first week, a lot of what I'm going to give you is background, general background on the music, talk to you about some of the stuff that you have to listen for in the piece, but also give you an idea of where this music came from. So let's start with the basics, which was that the piece is called Pictures, literally from an exposition. Actually, not Pictures at is actually an incorrect translation, but that's okay. And it started from a series, from an exposition that was held in St. Petersburg in 1873 to illustrate the at the death of Mussorgsky's close friend Victor Hartmann. And Victor Hartmann was an artist and an architect who had died suddenly of an aneurysm at the age of 39. And in order to honor him, they did this exposition of his paintings in St. Petersburg. The exposition was organized by the music and art critic by the name of Stasov, who was in fact the person who had introduced Mussorgsky and Hartmann, and they shared various ideals, and they were actually very, very close. The biggest problem is that Hartmann was not a very good artist. And if it were not for the piece of music associated with it, he would be completely unknown to history, which is kind of a funny thing. But as I said, he did share some of the ideals of Mussorgsky, and his death was a big blow. The particular ideal that was very important, and it's one that's central to the study of the score, is that Hartmann, despite the fact that, as you could tell by his name, was of a German background, was a Russian nationalist like Mussorgsky, and believed very strongly in trying to rid Russian culture of Germanic elements, and of trying to rid it also of foreign elements altogether, and to work to create a genuine native Russian art. And Mussorgsky, of course, was central to his own aesthetic. And it was essentially the aesthetic of the group that we know as the Mighty Five or the Mighty Handful, who were a group of 5 composers who were all supposed to be working towards that same goal. The 5 composers in the group were Mussorgsky, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, César Cui, and Mily Balakirov. Of the 5, only one was actually a professional composer. The rest were all amateurs. The only professional composer in the group was Balakirov. And the rest of them were essentially amateurs, and that actually is a very, very important part of understanding how they came to it. Later on, of course, Rimsky-Korsakov became a professional. He got himself a job. There's a famous story about he got himself a job at St. Petersburg Conservatory teaching theory, and that, as he put it, I was 1 chapter ahead of the class in learning theory when I was teaching the course. He ended up writing, actually, Rimsky-Korsakov ended up writing very, very academic harmony in a way. And that may have come about from the fact that he learned harmony by teaching it. But in the case of Mussorgsky, he made a conscious effort to move away from what we would consider to be the type of harmonic language and the type of harmonic ideas that you got in typical Romantic music. If you compare his music with, like say Tchaikovsky's even, or somebody who was more Germanic in his thinking, his music was, one would say, almost primitive. There was a tendency to use like very, very block chords, a tendency to avoid some of the things that we consider typically romantic in terms of flowing melodic stuff. He tried to make the harmonies crude and simple. And this is important in terms of understanding the piece, Pictures at an Exhibition, because it comes out of that idea. Yet at the same time, we are going to hear it, not in the version that he originally wrote, which was for solo piano, but in an orchestration by Maurice Ravel, who was, in contrast to Mussorgsky, the absolute height of sophistication. So you have this orchestration that's put on, a coloristic view of music, a coloristic view of how to make the music sound. It's exceedingly sophisticated, put on top of an idea of a kind of neo-primitivism that you get in Mussorgsky's own thinking. And so that tension is a central part of creating the worldview and the musical language that's being explored in the music. Several other things about the composition. The composition, when Hartmann died, shortly afterwards, the Stasov came up with the idea of doing the exposition to honor him. And there were, I think, about 130 paintings at this exposition. And Mussorgsky went and saw it, of course. And after he came back, a few months later, he was inspired to write this piece. And he wrote it in very short order. I think it took him like less than a month to write it. And it was written and directly responding to 10 of the pictures that he saw at the exposition. Unfortunately, today, most of those pictures don't survive. There are 6 pictures that survive, and one of the movements involves using 2 of the pictures. So we don't even have the pictures for some of the movements. But it's kind of interesting to look at the pictures. First thing you'll notice is if anybody's ever seen drawings done by architects, this looks much more like what an architect would draw than what a real artist would draw. They have a kind of staticness to the pictures. He was not a very dynamic artist. Nevertheless, and there's something about the fact that, again, there's a contradiction between this very, very interesting and flowing music and this extremely static artistic expression. Now, I'd like us to look at the 6 pictures that actually do exist. So Graham can pull those up. And if we can zoom in on them, I don't know if that's possible. Yeah. Okay, here is from the Ballet of the Unhatched Chicks. As you can see, it's a very, very peculiarly anthropomorphic vision of the chicks, right? But if you listen to Mussorgsky's music, which you're all familiar with it, it's got this very, very much chicks type of vision to it, and yet doesn't look like, they look like they're in the middle of hatching, and they're rather anthropomorphic in any case. So that was one of the pictures that did survive. Second, you've got the 2 Jews. We look at each of them. Okay. This movement is sometimes called Samuel Goldenberg and Shlomo. There is Samuel Goldenberg. He is the rich Jew. Okay. That picture was actually owned by Mussorgsky himself. He actually owned that picture. he had the picture of the two Jews. Both of those pictures were given by Hartmann to Mussorgsky. And the idea of this is you're looking at a wealthy Jew, and it contrasts with the look of the second Jew, who, if you come in, you could see the kind of hunched over type of manner, the poor guy. Now, I find it fascinating that Mussorgsky had these two pictures. Mussorgsky was a virulent anti-Semite, famously so. And it's interesting that he would have wanted these two pictures. But Hartmann did do them for him. I don't know anything about Hartmann's anti-Semitism. We say he's a virulent anti-Semite, but we have to keep in mind that in the late 19th century, being a virulent anti-Semite was par for the course. Most people were anti-Semitic, and most were pretty aggressively anti-Semitic. Curiously, among the people who were not anti-Semitic were the person who, in fact, largely saved Mussorgsky's posthumous reputation, and that was Rimsky-Korsakov. And Rimsky-Korsakov was, in fact, responsible for the first edition of Pictures at an Exhibition actually being published. He was responsible for the opera Boris Godunov, which is the central and most important piece of Mussorgsky's reputation as a composer. He was responsible for that becoming part of the repertoire. And yet he himself did not share any of that anti-Semitism. So although we generally associate late 19th century Russia with a time of ferocious anti-Semitism, two of the most prominent people in late 19th century Russia, which were Rimsky-Korsakov and Glazunov, who was head of the Moscow Conservatory, they were quite the opposite and went out of their way to have good relations with Jews. And as a matter of fact, in Glazunov's case, he was responsible for doing a tremendous amount to help out his Jewish students. So it's an interesting issue. But that particular movement is very, very striking, and it's one we'll talk about in some detail next week, because it has one of the world's most famous trumpet solos, and we will talk about that in detail. Next, we've got a picture of the catacombs, don't we? The catacombs movement was one of the later movements in there, and the idea was, if you see this sort of shadowy picture, he was trying to talk about the catacombs in Paris. And this, I think, was a picture taken that he drew on a trip to Paris. And the catacombs movement is extremely dark. The whole idea of it, starting with this just very, very, and then he's got something impossible on the piano. He's got a crescendo on a single note. We can't do that. I don't know what he wanted. I generally do that by putting the pedal down, and you have these dense chords. And so that darkness, you can sort of feel that. And then, of course, the second part, which I'll talk about more later. That sort of thing. Hear that? And that's, of course, something we'll talk about in more detail later. But that sort of darkness was very much part of that. This movement is, the reason I illustrated a little bit of it is it's not as well known as some of the other movements. And then we have the Baba Yaga, don't we? The Baba Yaga. That's kind of interesting because of the fact that most of the people, when they do the pictures of the Baba Yaga, this was a creature kind of in Russian folklore, who's kind of a witch type of character. And you look at that picture, and I don't think you get much feeling for that. It's kind of the hut of the Baba Yaga. it doesn't look like it was that. It looks like kind of a weirdly Russian place. But I mean, my question would be, does it really suggest? Doesn't really suggest that darkness that's part of it, and the whole mood of the piece, you know, is so much more vivid than the actual picture, which is kind of nothing. The last one is the famous Great Gates of Kiev. I was very disappointed to discover that the Great Gates of Kiev never were built. It was a plan for this to be built. I've been to Kiev, and they have catacombs, but they do not have a Great Gate. And this was a plan for it. And this extremely majestic piece that you all are familiar with was, in fact, based on a plan that never came to fruition. Those are the only ones that we have. So we have no idea what picture it was that was being thought of for the old castle. We don't know what was being thought of for the Polish ox cart. These pictures, the children at play, we don't know what he was thinking of or what picture was being represented. I've seen people where they try to do things where they kind of substitute in some other picture to try to sort of make up for that while they show the Hartmann ones for the ones that exist. But we really don't know. And we really don't know what they were. We can assure you, well, the one thing I think we could be really sure of is that the music was a lot better than the pictures, because for the ones we know, they are there. Okay, do we have some questions?
There are questions, but Kathleen says that the Baba Yaga picture says horloge in the upper right corner.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I thought when I looked at it. Perhaps the clock is designed as a hut.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was a clock.
It was a clock. Yes, it was a clock. Horloge. Yes. Yes, it was. Any other questions people have? This is kind of a good spot for us to talk about. You don't see any yet? Okay, good. So having gone through some of that sort of stuff, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the composition and the history of the various orchestral versions that came about. As I said, Mussorgsky wrote it for piano solo, and he wrote it in 1873. It was performed for the first time in 1874, and he was very excited about the piece. He thought it was great. However, the reception was not terribly positive. So he put it aside, went back to drinking, and did not do much with it, and left it in manuscript, as he did many of his other pieces. After his death, he died in 1881. About 5 years later, Rimsky-Korsakov came out with the first edition of the piece. And for many, many years, this was the only edition that people knew. As he did with so many others of Mussorgsky's music, including notoriously Boris Godunov, he did not strictly give us what Mussorgsky wrote. He did his own edition of it. He did not change that much in the way of notes, but he changed a lot of dynamics. And he changed a lot of the expression, and in a few cases actually changed some of the orientation on the piano. One of the things that was particularly striking about this was that it was this version, Rimsky-Korsakov's version, that was the source of the early orchestral arrangements, including Ravel's. So we had this kind of corrupt text that was being used for the orchestration. So Ravel's is based on a corrupt text. There are the things that are the most notorious difference, which is very obvious when you listen to the orchestral version, is in the Polish ox cart movement. If you listen to the orchestral version starts starts softly, then gets louder towards the middle. This was, in fact, from Rimsky-Korsakov. In the original version, and I think I'll play you a couple of bars of it just to show you what it was like. Here was what the original has. Hardly pianissimo, okay? It was originally very, very loud and diminishing at the end. Dear me, okay. And it was diminishing at the end. And so this was, in fact, a very, very different version of the piece. There's many other small changes, enough so that if you follow the original score, you're not going to be able to necessarily follow it 100%. If the original piano score, when you listen to an orchestral version of it, except for more recent ones. Now, let me get into the orchestral version of it, okay? There have been over 100 arrangements of pictures at an exhibition for many combos of instruments, including one that I heard for Hawaiian steel guitar. I'm not joking. I know the guy who did it, and I don't have that recording. I wish I did. I have his recording of his arrangement of Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun, and I put it on once at a party when people, what I was thinking that they would definitely think they had too much to drink when they heard it. But this particular one, yeah, he did that. There have been various ones. There's ones for, there's the entire thing done for trumpet and piano. It's an awful version. Doesn't work at all. There's a version by a fellow by the name of Leonardi that's for piano and orchestra. And there are many, many, many versions for full orchestra, in addition to Ravel's. Ravel's was actually I think the third or fourth that came out. There was an earlier version. There was the first one was Tushnikov. That was done shortly after Rimsky-Korsakov first originally published it. And that one has kind of completely disappeared. There's then there was a version by Sir Henry Wood. It was done about 1920 for one of the Proms concerts. Very, very interesting, imaginative version, kind of a neat one. But Wood, after then Ravel's came in 1922, and he wrote it for Serge Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony. And Koussevitzky, after Wood heard that version, he proceeded to forbid performances of his own version and only did the Ravel version. And the Ravel version became absolutely the standard for many, many years. However, there were other people who did things. Leopold Stokowski did his own version, which he used to say he wanted to do a version that was more Slavic because he thought that the Ravel version was too French. And that concept that the Ravel version is too refined, too French, has very much influenced the way a lot of people have viewed it. After Stokowski left the Philadelphia Orchestra, Eugene Ormandy decided that he wanted to have a version for the Philadelphia Orchestra that was not Stokowski's, and he asked Lucien Caillet, who was a clarinet player in the orchestra, who was orchestrating a lot of stuff for them, to actually do another version, and that version was around for a while too. All those versions are based on Rimsky-Korsakov. None of them are based on the original manuscript. Once the original version came out, once Mussorgsky's original version came out, and it came out sometime in the 1930s, but was not generally available until the 1950s. Then other people said, well, we've got to do a version that actually is true to what Mussorgsky wrote. And then there were a number of versions that came out like that. But probably the best known of the more recent versions is by Vladimir Ashkenazy, who did a version with very much the same idea in mind as Stokowski had about Slavifying it. It's much darker, and it doesn't have some of the things that we associate with the piece. And so there's been a very, very long history of orchestrating it. There is a general belief that the music, that the original piano version is unpianistic. That is marginally true. And let me just sort of say that it's not true in general. There are several things that you will notice about it, and there are things about it that actually make it more effective on the piano than in the orchestra. The first is his choice of keys. I'm going to go through, and this is something that, you know, may make you not want to play the piece when you start hearing his choice of keys. Okay, first movement's in B flat, nothing wrong with that, okay? Second movement, okay, is in essentially G flat, okay, or E flat minor, depending upon how you read it. The third movement, nobody knows what key it's in because it keeps changing. Okay, the old castle is in G sharp minor. Get the picture? These are great keys on the piano. They don't work so well in the orchestra. So, okay, you go on, children quarreling after play. Okay, B major. Okay, Ballet of the Chicks is in F. That's not really much of a problem. The Two Jews, okay, where are we? We're B flat minor, okay? Promenade, next, the big promenade back B flat, the one that's not in the orchestral version. We'll talk about that in a bit. Marketplace of Limoges, E flat, and then after that, the keys get a little bit better through there, with E flat tending to dominate towards the end. But you have a number of movements in keys, G sharp minor, okay? B flat minor. Those are wonderful keys on the piano. Very easy to play in, very nice. Not so much fun to read maybe, but they're fun to play in. And they're very hard to come up with effective orchestral music in it because neither wind nor stringed players are comfortable in those keys. And part of the challenge for Ravel in writing his orchestration of it was how to deal with the keys. We'll talk about that a lot in the second and third sessions, talking about dealing with the keys and how he dealt with them and how your own approach to it, you have to keep in mind the keys that he chose. So having done all that, we take a look at that. The piano version itself, and it's very interesting that once Ravel's version came out, the piano version became rarely played. Now, I have to say, it wasn't that popular a piece even before. The piano version was never that popular. Ravel's version, the orchestral version, became very popular. In the 1940s, I think it was 1948, Vladimir Horowitz recorded a piano version that became a bestseller. Problem was he did not play Mussorgsky's music. He played his own version of it. He added lots of things. He decided to make it more pianistic. Mostly he made it flashier for himself. And that recording, though did inspire other pianists to play it, they couldn't get their hands, Horowitz was proprietary about it. He didn't let other people play his version, but they still started to play it. Then in 1958, the most famous recording of Pictures at an Exhibition for Piano came out. It's a recording by Sviatoslav Richter, done in the middle of, actually, time that should be kind of interesting for us. It was done in the middle of the Asian flu epidemic in Sofia, Bulgaria. And there you can hear, in addition to all the coughing, you have the best-selling recording of Pictures at an Exhibition for Piano that's ever been done in a concert that is absolutely legendary to all pianists. Everybody knows about Richter's performance in Sofia. It's a glorious one, and people even glory in the coughing that went on in that hall. And that was strictly, he went straight by the book. He did Mussorgsky's original version, and it's established that as the way in which it's been played on the piano. These days, both versions, piano and orchestra, are played all the time. And people always use, on the piano, they use Mussorgsky's version. The Ravel is still, by far, the most commonly played orchestral version. And it's become increasingly so now that it's in public domain in most of the world, so it's much easier for people to play it now. And in the old days, amateur orchestras used to go for one of the cheaper versions that were not as good. So And as I said, nowadays there are many, many, many fine recordings. One other thing I do want to address is there is one difference between the two scores, and then I'm going to go into talking to you a bit about the structure of the piece, which is that Ravel omitted one of the promenades, which is one of the movements, about the very opening, that opening movement. That comes back a bunch of times, and it's called promenade, which means that it's walking, it's transition between movements. Towards the end, he has a promenade movement that is very similar to the original. There's a few harmonic changes. It's just before the marketplace in Limon, and that movement is omitted in Rimsky-Korsakov's version. It cuts some time off the total. Rimsky-Korsakov, sorry, in Ravel's version, he decided not to include it. It's between the two Jews and the marketplace, and that he cut that out. And in a lot of performances, people, and in a lot of other versions, people have cut that movement out. I think it was a big mistake, and it bothers me that Ravel cut it out. But hey, it was his version. When we do it, we're going to do it his way. But I'm going to explain to you why I think it was a particularly bad mistake to remove that particular movement. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking to you a bit about the structure of the piece, but I think this is another spot where we could have some questions.
I don't have anything in my chat.
You don't?
I'm not sure if anyone else does.
Okay.
Oh, good.
All good? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about how the piece is put together. And this is, again, we're still in the generalized overview look at the music. What he's done is he's got 10 pictures, but the pictures are linked by a device, which is the promenade, which is that very opening that's in the Ravel version is done by the trumpets and then by the brass. It's that opening theme that we all know. That particular theme is it's a very what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to suggest walking. If you take a look, you will notice something about it, which is the fact that it alternates between 5/4 and 6/4 time. This is to suggest the irregularity of walking. By the way, I've never played the piano version of Pictures Annex. I mean, I've read it, I played at it a little bit. I never actually played it, never performed it. But the one time I did play it, I played it for somebody's wedding on the organ. They wanted the promenade, and everybody thought it was really weird. But I thought it wasn't a bad idea because the idea of you're walking and it's irregular. So that idea of walking through was the idea of the promenade. And the idea is that he goes to a picture, then there's a promenade movement where he moves to the next picture. So the promenade starts off and you have that walking melody, and then the second movement is the first picture, and that's a picture of gnomes, okay? And that starts with something that's kind of slower. And that is something that is very interesting because of the fact that it's kind of modern sounding. It's kind of 20th century sounding. But of course, because we're so familiar with it, it doesn't sound strange to us. And it has a very mysterious quality to it. It's like, and that particular combo, it's a very vivid characterization, and it's supposed to imply something kind of sinister. But I want you to keep in mind something with it. That structure that he has of something that is very, very kind of supernatural almost with the gnome movement, and then beginning with the promenade. It's echoed right at the end of the piece. He does exactly the same thing. where he has the hut of the Baba Yaga, this very, very kind of gnomey type of creature, ending with the Great Gate of Kiev, which uses as its theme the theme from the Promenade. So therefore, he has the parallels. The structure of the whole piece begins and ends with the same idea. Now, after the gnomes, you're walking again, and he has a shorter promenade. But again, it's the same thing. It's in 5/4 and 6/4, and you notice that movement. And it's kind of an inversion of it. And then from there, we go into the old castle. Now, for the old castle, is Julius with us yet? Does anybody know?
Yeah, I'm here. Hey, Warren.
What?
I said I'm here.
He's here? Oh, yeah. This is the famous movement which has the wonderful saxophone solo. And I'd like Julius to talk to us about the saxophone, its role in French music a bit, and the famous saxophone solo in this piece. Hi.
Hey, thanks for having me, Warren.
Sure.
It's good to see everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, little history on the saxophone. It was invented by a Belgian man named Adolf Sax, who came from his family had a history of making instruments, and he's actually, I think his parents are credited to like modernizing the French horn actually, and but he was really into creating new instruments. He was super innovative and created many instruments, most famously the saxophone, but he was actually credited for creating a new pattern for what we know as the bass clarinet today. He kind of upgraded the bass clarinet in the 1800s.
Excuse me, Julius, could you speak up a little bit? You're a little hard to hear.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
Just turn my microphone up.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for letting me know. So like I said, he created a lot of instruments besides the saxophone. He patented the saxophone in 1846. And, the saxophone originally was really invented to be played orchestrally and in military bands. He created, he moved from Belgium to Paris when he was kind of discouraged with, people not really, admiring his great works with all the different instruments he was building. And he was welcomed in Paris with open arms, specifically by Hector Berlioz, who really wanted to use his instruments, his sax horns, predecessors to the saxophone and the saxophone. But despite his Hector Berlioz's excitement for Adolf Saxophone's instruments, the saxophone never really took on as far as the orchestral. Being a true part of the orchestra. Of course, there's examples of composers using the saxophone, and obviously Ravel, Berlioz, and like in the Bolero as well. But Adolf Sax created this instrument to kind of hybrid, a brass instrument and a reed instrument. He was trying to create an instrument that could cut through an orchestra or a band like a brass instrument, but with the technical virtuosity of a woodwind instrument. And I'm going to share my screen, just show you some pictures. See if I can get my technology happening here. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So that's Adolf Sax, 1850s, and some of these are just some of the other instruments he created: saxo trombone, tromba, sax horn, sax tuba. Some really interesting looking instruments. And this is the original patent of the saxophone. Originally, he had, I think, 9 different keyed instruments. B flat, E flat, I think C and F, in different registers. Ultimately, the modern day saxophone, took many shapes to be the modern day saxophone as we know it today. But basically we have the B flat and E flat instruments. We have the E flat baritone sax, and below that, their B flat instrument, and then the tenor saxophone above that, and the alto, which I play mostly, and the soprano saxophone, and the sopranino in E flat. So it keeps going back between B flat and E flat. I'm going to play you just a little bit of the first classical saxophone quartet, which is really interesting sound. The recording quality is not great. It's a super old recording. But I just thought it would be nice to play some early saxophone for you. And this was the first virtuoso of the saxophone, Marcel Mule. And he started this quartet from the military bands in Paris. And here's a little clearer recording of Marcel Mule playing the Concertino da Camera by Ibert, one of the most famous saxophone pieces that people are still playing today, and he performed this with several orchestras. When Adolphe Sax died in 1894, he really had like the monopoly on the saxophone. He had a patent, so he was the only one that was allowed to make it until other manufacturers could make the saxophone. And then and he really had a monopoly, and it's so much so that when by creating this instrument, there's rumor that he was so the other manufacturers try to assassinate him for because what he was doing was going to revolutionize the military bands, and nobody else would be able to sell their instruments. So but then when he passed away in 1894, there was I think a little bit of a lull as far as the classical saxophone. Marcel Mule is really credited for kind of bringing it and making it a classical instrument, and brought it to the Paris Conservatory actually. And this is him playing the Ibert. So, I mean, just the sound, if you might not even recognize that as a saxophone if you're not really used to hearing classical saxophone. I know just the way the saxophone is used nowadays in modern music, obviously we probably maybe know the saxophone as more being a jazz instrument, and the sound has changed quite a lot. Sigurd Rauscher is another pioneer of the classical saxophone after Marcel Muehl, and he really extended the range of the saxophone, being able to play in the altissimo register. Marcel Muehl is also credited for playing the saxophone first with vibrato. And Sigurd Rauscher wrote a book called Top Tones that all saxophone players use now, for the overtone series to extend their range. Yeah, I don't know if there might be some questions for the saxophone. But how did the saxophone become a jazz instrument? I see that. That's a great question. Through the military bands, the saxophone came up and then was a little more popular there. And jazz music, early jazz music, there's a lot of history with the military bands and how jazz came about, the combination of European music and the black experience in America. So I think it was kind of a natural transition, but the saxophone really wasn't a jazz, known as a jazz voice till much later. In early jazz, it was more like an orchestral instrument still. The first great virtuoso of jazz saxophone is somebody named Sidney Bechet. He doesn't really get a lot of credit for being the first virtuoso. I think partly because he was a pretty crazy guy and pretty violent, and jazz historians kind of put him off to the side because he was just so nuts. But an incredible technician. And if you listen to early recordings of Sidney Bechet, who he influenced a lot of saxophone players. Johnny Hodges is one of them, of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. But he had a really heavy, tight, almost like kind of goatish vibrato. And then, but the first virtuoso that really came to notoriety was Coleman Hawkins, and he made a famous recording of Body and Soul. But before that, trombone and trumpet were really like the major voices, and in the clarinet as well in jazz, until the saxophone became like the king of the voice of saxophone with Coleman Hawkins, and obviously Charlie Parker after that, and John Coltrane. I think as far as why Ravel, he loved the saxophone. I mean, him, being from Paris, like I said, the saxophone in Paris was like a major thing. It was in the conservatory. It was accepted as a classical instrument and in the military band. So a lot of French composers were using it. They wrote a lot of solo saxophone repertoire, but Ravel is one of the few that used it in the orchestra. And I think for this particular piece, the Old Castle movement, I think it's a haunting melody, and in the range it's written, it just makes a lot of sense. We were talking about the saxophone being a combination of reed and brass, and just the way that the saxophone can kind of cut through the orchestra in that range, I think is one of the reasons he kind of chose the saxophone for that particular melody, because it has the main melody in that movement. I have a saxophone here. I'm going to play you just a little bit of the saxophone. Truth be told, I haven't played my classical setup in a long time, and I'm actually going to put it with a rag in my belt just because the sound's not going to be so great through the microphone. But and I say classical setup, we have different mouthpieces that we can use, and it might not even sound too different to you, but for me, it's a different kind of feeling as far as the way the air goes to the instrument, and you just use a kind of different setups. I use different setups for my clarinet as well if I'm playing in an orchestra or a classical situation, as opposed to trying to cut through a big band. And same goes for the saxophone. But so just a little excerpt of Eckel's Sonata, which was actually written for the bass. But Sigurd Rauscher, the top tone saxophone player I was telling you about, he transcribed it for saxophone. So it's a major piece of classical saxophone repertoire. take that low B high just because of the rag in my bell. So I took my own take on it. And this is my jazz setup, which is a little brighter. So if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them. Maybe Warren has some more insight into the Ravel version with the saxophone.
Any questions there, Graham?
Mary Beth wanted to know if Julius is playing for this company.
Definitely, I hope to maybe play the exhibition with you guys some point.
Yeah, that'd be great. A couple of things on this particular thing that you may have noticed is the differences in terms of how it's played. The technique is actually quite different for a classical and for a jazz saxophone sound. And I remember I've actually played, when you hear some of the old French school, their approach to vibrato is very different. Their approach, the type of sound they're trying to produce is very different. And what Julius was saying, the most important thing is that idea of it being not quite woodwind and not quite brass. And that is very much what he wanted with the old castle. He wanted a sound, and what's so funny is when we think of saxophone, we think of it as a modern instrument, yet he was using it precisely to give it an archaic character, okay? And the archaic character comes from the fact that musically it's working, it gives it, it doesn't, you're not quite sure what it is, okay? It's that ambiguity that made it important. Now, of course, he used it, as I said, but it was, when we think of, in the early time, was used as a French instrument. By the way, one of the earliest uses of saxophone in a kind of quasi jazz setting is in Darius Milhaud's La Création du Monde, which was written in 1919. And that is a piece that was inspired by Milhaud hearing jazz and then trying to put it into a French context. And it was both the beginning of French jazz and the use of the saxophone, and the brilliant saxophone part in that piece. And again, it created the French sound. So there was a very much a kind of French idea behind it. By the way, Sidney Bechet, who he mentioned, was a New Orleans musician, not a French musician despite the name. Well, New Orleans does have that French thing. But his sound was definitely different and definitely the beginning of a very different tradition in music. But the old castle movement is one that was I think when it was first played, the response of the audience was, wow, the use of the saxophone was such an important part of what made it so effective. And it was one of the reasons that Henry Wood said, oh, I can't compete with this, with his own version, because it was such an imaginative and perfect choice of instrument. And I'll get into in our next meeting, I will talk in much more detail about the aspects of the instrumental, the use of instruments in this piece. Just one or two more points before I let you go. I was going to say, in terms of the movements between them, I want you guys, if you get a chance to listen to a recording, listen to how he uses the promenades between them. He's got a promenade at the beginning. He's got a promenade between the first and second ones. He's got a promenade between the second and third. Then he goes straight to the fourth one. He's got a promenade between the fifth and the sixth. He goes straight to the seventh one. He's got a promenade between the sixth and the seventh, and then he goes to the marketplace of Limoges, and then the music changes. From the catacombs movement on to the end, the promenade becomes part of the thematic material used in the in the particular numbers. So you have the catacomb movement, starts with the catacombs, then it goes into a kind of reflection on that, done with the promenade music, and it's called For the Dead in a Dead Language. And that idea, then we have the Baba Yaga movement, and then the Great Gate of Kiev, which is like a grandiose, gigantic picture of the promenade movement. So instead of that same idea that we had at the beginning, that, sorry, what does it turn into in E flat? So he's taken that and expanded the promenade into the idea of the main thematic idea. In this way, he's trying to symbolically suggest the connection between the pictures and the musician who is viewing the pictures. He isn't just walking towards them, he is actively engaged in them. And the first one that he does that in is one that's a kind of memorial to his friend, and which is in the catacombs one, which is the very dark thing, and then it says, for the dead in a dead language, and he's giving his own theme and paying homage to his friend. And then the Great Gate of Kiev, at the end of it, it's both walking there and creating the music that is the picture, and there's a fusion of the two identities. So this is some general notes on the music. I had Julius come in and talk to us a bit about the saxophone, which plays such a prominent role in the one number and is such an important part of our understanding of Ravel's conception of the piece. Next week, we'll get into more detail in terms of the actual structure of an actual orchestration of the piece, how it was put together, and how he moves from one to the other. I gave you a little bit of a hint of that at the beginning here, but we'll go into a lot more detail next week. And Tom Camp will be coming in and talking to us about the brass writing and two of the famous brass solos, the one in the Polish ox cart that was written for tuba, really euphonium, and although he may dispute me on that, and the other one being the wonderful trumpet solos in Samuel Goldenberg and Shmuel. So do we have any questions?
Had a little bit of discourse here,
Yes.
Which was, why didn't more classical composers incorporate the saxophone?
Okay, there's actually a good reason for that.
First, there's the snobbishness, which is, I think, true.
Well, the problem is saxophone is, it's kind of a great solo instrument, but it is not a terribly effective, it doesn't blend easily with some of the other sounds. I mean, you can make it blend, but anybody who's tried to blend with a saxophone in a certain type of context, trying to get the vibrato to match, trying to get the sound quality to match is difficult. It tends to stand out. Now, that was intentional. I mean, Adolph Sax developed it as that transitional instrument between woodwind and brass. But that's one of the main reasons. It tends, when it comes in classical music, there's many prominent classical solos for it. I mean, there's the one in Lieutenant Kijé by Prokofiev, fantastic solo. There's the one, beautiful one in that Shostakovich has in his suite from the Nose. He's got a fantastic solo there. Certain the French composers used it more. I mean, Debussy, of course, wrote the Fantasy. There's the Ibert, which Julius played a bit of for you, very well-known piece. So it's tended to be featured when it's actually done because it doesn't blend all that well, although there have been very successful attempts to blend it, often when used as a separate section. So therefore, it's like you get two or three of them together, and then somehow they can create a particularly effective sound in certain versions, certain things. Mio did that from time to time. A number of French composers did that, where they used two or three of them. Vaughan Williams did it in the Ninth Symphony. And the use of several of them together, that creates a kind of unified sound. But it's tough to make them blend. It's not a natural blend.
And then the other question was mostly what recordings do you suggest you listen to?
Okay. If you're going to listen to it, I would suggest you both listen to a piano version and an orchestral version. If you're going to listen to a piano version, you got to listen to the Richter, coughing and all. It's important, okay? Because it's the basis of how everybody thinks of the piece who's a pianist. Even though lots of things he does are kind of eccentric. His promenades are too fast. Richter was a notoriously fast walker as a person, and it shows in how he walks around. Some of the tempos are ridiculously fast, especially in Baba Yaga. But you should hear it because that's how people think of it. For the recordings of the orchestral version, the Ravel, if you could find a Du Trois Montreal, I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube. I'm not sure if it is, but the recording with Montreal Symphony Orchestra and Charles Du Trois, in that repertoire, they are unequaled. In that repertoire, there's nobody close to them. And you should try to listen to those recordings. That would be the one I would recommend. Okay.
Those were all the questions I saw.
Okay. Any other things? Anybody last minute? Okay. If anybody has, hi. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Julius.
Guys.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed it.
Uh-huh.
Well, you'll have to tell me.
Thank you.
I fell asleep.